Hey everyone, welcome to another responsive design video. This is another video in my Putting It Together series. This video, what I'm going to do is just go over some changes that I made before I started recording. I made some changes to the way the grid is set up, just a little bit. I made some changes to the Whitespace and put some clamps on how wide certain containers can get so that everything kind of flows more smoothly within the frame at all sizes. Let's take a look at what it looks like in the browser. So here it is at full width. At full width, you can see that the actual grid container does not stretch from edge of page to edge of page. I feel like that would look a little bit silly if it got so wide that our line lengths got to be, 150 characters long and whatever, and things started to get way too spaced out. You'll notice that the feature sits nicely right in the center of the grid container, and it has a comfortable line length for the text, and the size of the image sits comfortably. You can see that the links have also been spaced out a little bit. Other things that you might notice is that there is more comfortable white space between the edge of the text and the edge of the grid container. So the page just looks better now than it did before. I'm going to look at it in the inspector just to see what it looks like when I debug, and I'm going to shrink it down. And you can see that as it shrinks down, things still look comfortable. Okay, let's look at these columns. You notice that there's always that padding on the left and right, and there's always a nice gap in between those columns, and then it breaks. I see one change that I think I'm going to want to make eventually here. And then you can see that it shrinks down to its smaller sizes. And when it gets down to its smallest, I set the minimum size to be 320 pixels, which is 20 ems. 320 is about the smallest that you're going to see on any kind of mobile devices. So it'll never get smaller than that. All right? So it grows and shrinks and responds really nicely to various sizes of things. All right, let's take a look at the CSS and see the changes that I made. I'll go through them step by step. You can make these changes in your CSS as well. Let's go up to the top. And a lot of the changes happened right here in Grid Container. Step one, what I did is I added a little bit of a grid gap. What the grid gap does is it puts a minimum amount of space in between all of my rows and columns. I set it to 2 rem. You could set it to whatever you want. You decide what the minimum width you want it to be. When I take that out, what it's going to do is it's going to make it so that the 2 columns will just squish right together and content will touch content. We don't want that. We want to have space in between that content. So even if it gets to the small size for 2 columns, those 2 columns can breathe nicely next to each other. So that was step one right here on line 60. Grid gap set to 2 rem. Here's another thing that I did in step one. I added padding to the grid container, right? So when I put padding in the grid container, it put that space around the edge of the content so that the content never touches the edge of the container. You might recall that before I made this video, the left side and right side of my 2 columns were touching the edge of the grid container. This just gives us a little bit of breathing, or a little bit of space. And when I hover over this in the debugger, you can see that those green buffers in between the content and the edge of the box, that's the padding, okay? So you can see it all the way up and down, and it's there. Next, let's see what I did for step 2. Oh, I think step 2 was the grid gap. Step 1 was the padding. So let's take a look at step 3. Initially, on my grid container, I just set a max width to 75 rem. So it would never get bigger than 75 rem, which is great. That's what I wanted. But it could also shrink down way too small and the content would bust out of its box and it would look bad. So I wanted to use a clamp on this so that it has a preferred size and then it's got a minimum and a maximum. Let's take a look at my preferred size. My preferred size is 100% of the view width minus 6 rem. So let's talk about why I did that little calculation there. So 100% of view width means it's going to prefer to fill up the whole entire space. If you think back to videos from a long time ago when you were learning about the box model, you may recall that the overall width of the box is going to be the length of it or the width of it that you set, so like 100%, plus the width of any margins and paddings on there. So if I put padding in there that's 3M, that's going to add 3M to the left, 3M to the right. So the overall width would be 100% plus 6% or 106%. So I want to make sure that I constrain that width to less than that. So I'm going to subtract that 6 rem, that 3 rem from the left and 3 rem from the right from the overall 100% view width. That's going to make sure that it never, overflows and has to use scroll bars and things like that. Okay, so that's going to be my preferred size. Then I set a maximum of 75 rem, which I had before. That was my max width. And I set a minimum of 20 rem. Why did I choose 20 rem? 20 rem breaks down to 320 pixels, and that is kind of the average for the smallest size on phones that you're going to find. You won't find any phones that are going to be narrower than 320. If there are any out there, it's such a small portion of the overall market share that it really does not matter. But honestly, I don't think you're going to find one smaller than 320. It's kind of the industry standard for minimum sizes for responsive designs. All right, so that was step 3, clamp it down. Next step, what I did was remember when I had the feature just taking up the 3 center columns and I had nothing in the left and right? I decided I would change that. I decided that I wanted to have the feature take up the entire width, and then I would constrain its size, okay? So I'd make sure it never got larger than a certain size, and it never got smaller than a certain size. And then it had a preferred size as well. So that's step 4. I had to do this for both of my breakpoints right here and right here. So in the min width 64 rem, I made sure to take those dots out and put feature in. And for the min width 48 rem, I made sure to take those dots out and put the features in to that line. Right? Next step. Here's where I decided to clamp the feature. Right? I decided to have it default to 100% width. That's its desired size. Its desire is to fill up all of the available space. And if I do 100%, what it's going to do is it's going to stretch from edge of container to edge of container. And so because our grid container has those padding buffers on the left and right, the feature is going to stretch from that padding on the left to the padding on the right. That's what it's going to want to do. Now, if the box, the grid container, ever gets down below 35 characters, this will not get smaller than that. And if it ever gets wider than 75 characters plus 250 pixels width, it will never get wider. So that's its minimum and its maximum. So why did I choose 75 characters plus 250 width? If we look at this, my feature has an image here that's 250 pixels wide. And then I don't want this ever to get wider than 75 pixels. So this just gives it a comfortable size to fit the image and the text next to each other. It'll never get too wide. It'll never get too narrow. And it just looks nice at all sizes. Okay? Let's take a look at step 6. The next step was to make sure that my feature was always sitting in the middle of its container. If you recall, we made the feature stretch from left to right, from, take up all 5 columns of the grid. And because I constrained its width to a maximum of this and a desired size of this, it might not take up the whole width at times. So because of that, I wanted to set the margins on left and right to auto, so it always sits in the center of its row. Okay, so it doesn't go over to the left side. That's step 6. Step 7, and I don't recall where it was. It must be up towards the top. Yeah, step 7 was to normalize the widths of all the columns. Before I did this, the different columns had different widths, and they were based on the amount of content in each column. So column 2 was going to be 250 pixels wide at all times because it had the image was the only thing that was in that column. And it kind of made it so that the left and right columns in my 2-column layout were the same. That's not what I wanted. I wanted it to be 3/5 to 2/5 for those 2 columns. So by going grid template columns and then choosing repeat 5/1FR, what it's doing is it's setting up all those columns to have 5 columns repeated at 1FR each, so 1 fractional each. That means they'll all be proportional 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 to 1. They'll all take up exactly 1/5 of the overall width of my grid. So that's step 7. And then step 8, I added the white space in between the nav links. And to do that, you have to add a whole new style rule, nav, ul, li. So we're selecting only the list items that exist in ULs in the nav, and we're giving them margins of 0 and 3 rem. So it's going to give it 3 rem on the left and right, and that works. And as we saw, as it scaled down, it fit really nicely in between my 2 large and small breakpoint, and then actually everything above the small breakpoint. But then when it breaks the small, the navigation goes from horizontal to vertical. So the margin on the left and right don't really matter all that much. Now, let's take a look at one more thing with this, because I said there was one more change that I was going to make. When I get to this breakpoint here, boom. Notice how all of my content, my left and right columns here, they don't sit nicely in the center, and I'd like them to do that. If we take a look at my my breakpoint, here's my breakpoint to go to 2 columns. This happens at 1024, right? So everything below 1024 is then taking up all 5 columns of the grid, right? You can see that. But because the content will never get any wider than 75 characters, I want to ensure that those will sit in the center nicely. So let's go over to the CSS, and I'm going to go to the main content and the side content, and I'm going to set margins on it. I'm just going to go margin 0 auto, so that it's always going to sit in the center unless it doesn't. So I'm going to save it, refresh it, and you see that content moved into the center, and it's always sitting in the center no matter what. And now it sits comfortably in there at small size screens, at slightly wider size screens. So there's my 768, so you can see it breaks there. And then when it goes up to 2 columns, those 2 columns sit nicely next to each other. And there you have it. This is a nice looking layout at all of those breakpoints at variety of sizes, and it should look good on all devices. We're not done with this video series yet. There's one more video that I want to do, and I want to work with the images and make sure the images are responsive and that they load various size images for the different viewport widths. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.